Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered the Russian military to prepare for a reciprocal response after the U.S. test-fired a new missile that would have been banned under the now scrapped Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, also known as the INF. The treaty was signed between U.S. and Soviet Union in 1987 to eliminate some of their nuclear missiles and to stop their dangerous buildup in Europe. Putin's comments followed a heated UN meeting on Thursday, where the U.S. and Russia each accused the other of risking a new arms race. Washington withdrew from the treaty on August the 2nd. Moscow followed suit immediately. Has a new arms race just begun with the demise of the INF? And what does its termination mean for the world's peace and security? These questions and more in tonight's debate. But before that, let's watch a background report.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has vowed that his country will respond in kind to a U.S. missile test banned under a Cold War-era nuclear treaty, which became defunct after Washington's withdrawal on August the 2nd.
I ordered the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, and other core offices to analyze the level of the threat for our country created by the activities of the United States and to undertake comprehensive measures to prepare the symmetric response.
Putin's reaction followed verbal clashes between the U.S. and Russia at a UN Security Council meeting over the Sunday's missile test and the U.S. pullout of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF. The U.S. accused Russia of deliberately violating the treaty, a claim Moscow rejects. Russia also withdrew in the wake of U.S. pullout, accusing Washington of using the pullout as a pretext to deploy previously banned missiles in different regions of the world.
On the whole, do you realize that because of the U.S.'s geopolitical ambitions, we are all one step from an arms race that could not be controlled or regulated in any way? We are very concerned by the prospect of that.
Indeed, the Russian Federation and China would still like a world where the United States exercises self-restraint while they continue their arms buildups, unabated and unabashed.
China's UN envoy also slammed what he called Washington's unacceptable behavior, saying Beijing will not participate in a U.S.-proposed trilateral arms control treaty between the Asian nation, Russia and America. At the same time, Russia says it doesn't want to get involved in an arms race and is still open to an equal and constructive dialogue with Washington to reinforce international security. The INF, which was signed in 1987, banned the production, testing and deployment of land-based cruise and ballistic missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. The demise of the treaty has raised fears of a global arms race which could threaten the world's peace and security. U.S. President Donald Trump has pulled out of several similar landmark agreements, which help maintain cooperation and stability at global levels. Now it remains to be seen how the international community would react to the most recent U.S. hawkish position that can potentially raise the threat of an uncontrollable arms race.
Joining us on tonight's debate, we have publisher and editor of Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos, who's joining us from the British capital, London, and also we have journalist and author Daniel Lazar, who's with us from New York. Let's start off with our guest in London. Mr. Papadopoulos, Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered government agencies to take exhaustive measures to prepare a reciprocal response to the recent missile test conducted by the U.S. Are we witnessing the start of a fresh global arms race?
Well, what this latest development demonstrates is that there is an arms race underway between America and Russia, not the kind of arms race that the world was witness to between the United States and the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, an arms race is today underway between Washington and Moscow. And the fact that the world again is witness to an arms race between the two superpowers is solely the fault of the Americans. And it is irrefutable because there is overwhelming evidence to blame the American government for this arms race. If we go back to 1992, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Pentagon produced a document called the Defense Planning Guidance, more commonly known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, known after its architect, Paul Wolfowitz, which identified Russia as the only country in the world capable of destroying the United States. And it urged for Washington to take steps to limit Russia's ability. But the problem for the Americans was that standing in their way of tackling the Russian nuclear arsenal and Russia's industrial military complex was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So what did the Americans do? They took a number of steps to undermine and ultimately kill the INF Treaty. First of all, at the beginning of 2002, the Americans pulled out of the ABM Treaty. And then in 2006, 2007, the Americans began the construction of a missile defense system in Eastern Europe, which was not only aimed at upsetting the nuclear balance between America and Russia, but also that missile defense system, which is today operational with components in Romania and Poland, can be fitted with offensive missiles. Now, those two acts, withdrawing from the ABM Treaty and constructing a missile defense system in Eastern Europe, severely weakened the INF Treaty. In fact, it ultimately killed it. So that is why we are where we are today. The Americans are taking very decisive and hostile steps to target the Russian nuclear arsenal and to target the industrial military complex of the Russian Federation, because the Americans are acutely aware, as they were back in 1992, that Russia is the only country capable of not just challenging American global hegemony, but of destroying America, literally destroying America. And that is all the more so under Vladimir Putin. So that's why the Americans had to kill the INF Treaty, because in order to take decisive action against Russia, they had to get rid of that INF Treaty. And Russia is merely responding. Russia, only 74 years ago, lost nearly 30 million people in a world war. They are not going to tolerate any threat to their national security, and they are well within their rights to respond to any American testing of a cruise missile.
Let's bring in Daniel Lazar from New York. Mr. Lazar, Putin said the missile test left, quote, no doubts that the real intention behind the U.S.'s recent decision to withdraw from the INF Treaty was to untie its hands to deploy previously banned missiles in different regions of the world. Do you think that the U.S. was preparing to terminate the INF Treaty all along?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think that was quite clear once Trump brought neocons like John Bolton into his administration, people who are completely opposed to the very idea of nuclear arms control. The U.S. is behaving very aggressively at this point. Trump is trying to assert U.S. global hegemony in a new and aggressive way, even while undermining NATO, for example. And to me, it seems clear that the real target of the latest missile test is not only Russia, but China as well. I think the U.S. aims to ring China with a whole cruise missile nuclear attack system because it sees China as a major threat in the Western Pacific. But I also might add that that arms control, the very idea of arms control, is being upset by new generations of missiles coming, new generations of weapons coming online. Not only new cruise missiles, but new and exotic weaponry like hypersonic cruise missiles, which could deliver a nuclear warhead to a foreign city within minutes and would be essentially impossible to defend against. So I think that over the next few years we'll see a increasingly energetic move towards development of new generations of missiles with vastly enhanced capabilities.
Marcus Papadopoulos, our guest in New York, mentioned China. Let's talk about some of the reactions to this move by the United States. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman recently said that the test showed the U.S. was stoking a new arms race and confrontation, which would have a serious negative impact on regional and global security. Also, the Trump administration's plans to place missiles in the Asia-Pacific region will also be met with harsh opposition from Beijing as well, won't it?
Indeed, it is not just the Russian Federation that the Americans are trying to encircle and weaken, it is also China. Let us remind ourselves, a few years ago, the Americans installed a missile defense system very similar to the one in Eastern Europe in South Korea. Who is that aimed at? Well, it is aimed, once again, at the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent, because, of course, there are many Russian nuclear arsenal sites, land-based in particular, across the whole of Russia, including the Far East. But that American missile defense system in South Korea is also aimed at the Chinese strategic nuclear deterrent. So that is why the Chinese are condemning America's testing of a cruise missile last Sunday, because they know that it is not just aimed at Russia, it is aimed at China. The Americans do not wish to share power in the world with any other country. Any country which challenges America will be, first of all, demonized by American mainstream media. Secondly, that country's economy will be targeted. And thirdly, that country will see an increase of the presence of the American military close to its borders, on the ground, maritime waters, and in the air. So that is why the Chinese have to be very, very careful about this growing threat. But I should make very clear that the Americans pulling out of the INF Treaty was first and foremost aimed at Russia. The Russian nuclear arsenal is, by a significant amount, the largest in the world. The Chinese nuclear arsenal is, comparatively speaking, very, very small. The only threat, the true threat to American global dominance, comes from Russia. Remember, the Chinese and the American economies are interlocked. China does not want to take on the Americans, though of course they will defend themselves. But of course, it is Russia's mission, it is Russia's destiny to challenge American global dominance and to ensure that in the world there are two superpowers. And if there are two superpowers in the world, then there is more stability, there is more chance for peace. Go back to the 1990s when Russia was on its knees. America was able to do what it wanted. For example, in the former Yugoslavia in the early 2000s, going into Iraq. It's 2019, the situation has changed. Vladimir Putin is in power. He has made Russia a superpower. That is why the Americans are becoming more and more hostile, more and more desperate to take on Russia.
Daniel Lazar, European officials have expressed worries that without this INF treaty, Europe could again become an arena for nuclear-armed intermediate-range missile buildups by both the United States and Russia. Where do you think Europe fits in all of this?
Well, I think those concerns are correct. I think that Europe could really find itself in the middle as it becomes a staging area for U.S. cruise missiles. Frankly, I don't expect the Europeans to react very forcibly. They've shown themselves to be extremely weak and disunited in terms of a response. I wanted to add that the most important arms control treaty that the U.S. has pulled out of is the Iranian nuclear accord. And this also is contributing to a new arms buildup, because the U.S. sanctions, the U.S. economic warfare that is now waging on Iran, since pulling out of that treaty, sends a very clear message that any country which fears invasion or harassment or attack by the U.S., the only recourse it has is to develop nuclear weapons, because that is the only logic that Washington understands. So therefore, in the wake of what's happened with Iran, I think we can expect to see many more countries striving to arm themselves with nuclear weapons. And of course, that is extremely dangerous in terms of a global arms race. I mean, the last thing the world needs now is more nuclear proliferation. But Trump's behavior in the Persian Gulf sends a very clear message that is what's going to happen.
Mr. Papadopoulos, speaking of pulling out of international agreements, the New START agreement, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, expires in less than 2 years. Hypothetically, if the Trump administration is still in the White House, do you think that treaty could be at risk too?
Oh, I certainly think so. I think that for the Trump administration, any treaty that stands in its way of preventing America from taking on the Russian nuclear arsenal and from taking on Russia's industrial military complex will have to be undermined and ultimately dismantled. But I would add this as well. No one should be under the illusion that if Mr. Trump loses the next presidential election, that his successor is not going to take the same hardline approach to Russia. Why? Because ultimately, whoever is in the White House, Republican or Democrat, they are merely puppets. The real force in America is, of course, the American establishment or the American elite. The people you don't see in front of the cameras, they are the ones who pull the strings. They are the ones who effectively dictate to whoever's sitting in the White House how America is going to behave in the world, how America is going to take on Russia. So yes, the START treaty is under threat from the Trump administration, but I believe it will be under threat from his successor. And I would agree with the guest in America, and I think it's important that the guest in America brought up the issue about Iran, because what stood in the way of America countering the Russia of today, the INF Treaty? What stood in the way of America taking on Iran? The JCPOA agreement. That is why Trump pulled out, withdrew from that nuclear agreement with Iran, because it prevented America from taking hostile and decisive action to undermine the Iranian government, to undermine the Iranian economy. So that's how the Americans behave. If there is a treaty standing in its way of taking aggressive action against a country that's challenging its dominance, it will get rid of that treaty.
Mr. Lazar, at the time of the terminating of the INF, Washington had accused Russia of aggressive expansionism. It seems to be the other way around, though, as the U.S. has been trying to expand NATO to surround Russia, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Washington worldview is very much an upside-down worldview, in which countries that are really the victims of U.S. aggression are somehow portrayed as aggressors, and the U.S. is always perennially on the defensive. But it's not true. The U.S. is a highly aggressive superpower in the best of times, and under Trump has turned even more so. So yes, the U.S. has been turning up the gas. It has adopted an extremely hostile attitude towards Russia and to all countries that it sees as somehow within Russia's orbit, and those include Iran, Syria, etc. So, yes, the U.S. is pushing extremely aggressively and extremely dangerously, because at some point, things will spin out of control and a real military confrontation will ensue.
Marcus Papadopoulos, the U.S. has always been playing the role of hall monitor when it comes to arms control, but when will the U.S. itself be ready to discuss arms control and elimination of weapons of mass destruction?
No, it is not in the interests of the American establishment for such a thing to happen. What the Americans are intent on achieving is, number one, safeguarding their global dominance, and number two, strengthening their global dominance. And they have demonstrated since the 1990s that they are prepared to use any means necessary to achieve that. They demonstrated their violent nature in the former Yugoslavia. They demonstrated their violent nature in Iraq, and again in Libya, and again in Syria. They have targeted what Russia calls the near abroad, i.e. countries which used to be a part of the Soviet Union, for example, Ukraine. That is making the world an unbelievably dangerous place to live in. And I take no rejoice in the knowledge that there is an arms race today underway between America and Russia. What sane person would celebrate that? However, there is no choice. If anyone in the world truly supports a more stable, a more peaceful world, then they have to understand that Russia is the only country in the world that can limit American expansionism, that can limit American aggression. And if that means Russia designing and introducing into its nuclear arsenal new missiles, then regrettably, so be it. This is not Russia's fault, this is America's fault. Action, reaction. The Americans have been slapping Russia's face since the 1990s, but since Vladimir Putin came to power, the Americans have now had a taste of their own medicine.
Daniel Lazar, your final thoughts on the issue?
Well, I think the liberal global order is falling apart very rapidly. The neoliberal global order, and diplomatic relations are in disarray all over the world. The very dangerous situation in the Persian Gulf is one aspect of that, and a resumption of a nuclear arms race in any form is another important aspect of that. And Donald Trump represents the rebellion against the status quo, but of course, what he wants to replace it with is far worse. A policy of U.S. Egoism, aggression, etc., in which the U.S. feels free to behave in however provocative and aggressive a manner it wishes, and all other countries are expected to back off. But at some point, that strategy will come to an end, because at some point,
Very well.
one of these countries will push back.
Thanks a lot, publisher and editor of Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos, joining us from the British capital, London, and also thanks to journalist and author Daniel Lazar joining us from New York. Thank you, gentlemen, for contributing to this segment of the program, and also special thanks to your viewers for staying with us on tonight's debate. Bye, everybody.